Gavrilo Princip is the reason there was a Second World War. Because Gavrilo Princip is the reason there was a first. And to be fair to Princip, if you could have gone to him and shown him the ramifications of what that one day would do to the world, I think he'd be horrified. He wasn't trying, to unleash a global world war. He just became the latest example of someone pulling the trigger in a giant historical game of Russian roulette. A trigger that had been pulled several times already with nothing, happening. Who would have thought that the time that Princip pulled it, that would be the time that the, metaphorical revolver pointed at the skull of the old world shot a bullet into its brain. Perhaps Princip and his compatriots would have thought that, sometimes when you're trying to create a new world, you have to utterly destroy the old one. And the people in that old world were not naive about the potential for someone like a Princip to do what they did. I mean, Otto von Bismarck, one of the greatest diplomats of 19th century Europe, perhaps the greatest diplomat Germany ever produced, famously said that if there was going to be some giant global conflict, it was going to probably break out because of some damn fool event in the Balkans. Gavrilo Princip shot 2 people in the city of Sarajevo, smack dab in the Balkans, a place that Otto von Bismarck had famously said was not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. It cost a hell of a lot more than that. And Princip becomes yet another example in history, proving to us that sometimes when it comes to something like terrorism, in this era, by the way, when we try desperately to keep weapons of mass destruction out of the terrorists' hands because we're afraid they'll be able to kill more people with such weapons, we forget that sometimes it's not about how many people you kill, sometimes it's about who they are. And often, it's not the terrorist act that changes the world, it's the response of the victims, that does. Gavrilo Princip killed 2 people, and he did so in a way that almost makes you believe in fate. And truthfully, I'm not much of a fate believer, but one of the things I like about history is how it forces me to challenge some of my own preconceptions and certainly make me think about other possibilities. I've always thought, for example, that history unfolds for chaotic reasons. That it's somewhat random, that millions of people going about their lives in their own ways, with trends and forces acting upon them, and people in important positions making decisions, and all this together creates a dynamic that's completely unpredictable, as I said, somewhat chaotic and random, and unfolds into the future. I think my logical side of the brain appreciates that sort of viewpoint. The problem is that sometimes history confronts us with events where the logical part of at least my brain wants to flip sides and wants to logically defend what I consider to be the more illogical point of view. In this case, the logical part of my brain will sometimes shift and try to defend something like fate, or destiny, or predetermination. Those to me are the 2 ends of the scale. Chaos on one side and randomness on one side, and fate and predestination on the other. And there's this weird twilight zone where the 2 sort of intersect. And that event that happened in late June 1914 is one of the best examples you'll find from history where, the logical side of your brain stands a pretty good chance of flipping and trying to defend the illogical position that this is somehow predestined. I mean, let me challenge you with a similar kind of analogy. Take the John F. Kennedy assassination, for example, and imagine that in addition to Lee Harvey Oswald up at the Texas School Book Depository, you have another assassin on the grassy knoll, as has sometimes been suggested, and that in this JFK assassination attempt, Oswald misses, and the bullet strikes the ground, maybe injures some passersby, and everybody realizes an assassination attempt is happening, and the Secret Service get on the car and they speed away past the grassy knoll, past the other assassin who never gets a shot at President Kennedy, and then President Kennedy's gone. And no one knows what to do, no one's quite sure what happens, and then, later on, all of a sudden, while the assassin on the grassy knoll is probably trying to just figure out, okay, maybe what do I do now? The car with the president and his wife show up right down the road again, past the Texas School Book Depository, right to the grassy knoll where it proceeds to stall and stop. What are the odds of that? Kind of kooky, huh? History can be that way. Well, on June 28, 1914, Gavrilo Princip, and from 6 to some sources say 20 assassins, if you believe some of the people who claim to have taken part in these assassination attempts, show up in Sarajevo with murder on their minds. They want to kill the governing figure in Sarajevo, the person who is sort of the Prince Charles, plays the same role Prince Charles plays in the British monarchy right now, in the monarchy of the country that are the overlords in Sarajevo, a country that doesn't exist anymore, called Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary is led by a really old, very well-loved guy named Franz Joseph, who's going to die soon because he's very old. And the person who will take over when Franz Joseph dies is this guy coming on a visit to Sarajevo. The Prince Charles of his country, although unlike Prince Charles, whose role is completely ceremonial, this guy will actually have some real power when he gets the throne. And for some, now when you look back on it, looks like a stupid reason, this guy, whose name is Archduke Franz Ferdinand, has decided to go to Sarajevo and watch military maneuvers which happen to coincide with the anniversary of the most emotionally important, heart-wrenching, battlefield loss in all Serb history, the Battle of Kosovo, way back from hundreds and hundreds of years before this time period. Serb nationalists, and the Serbs are very, very patriotic even today, even more so back in 1914, look at this as a slap in the face. To them, Sarajevo is Slavic and should be part of at least a pan-Slavic country, or maybe part of Serbia. There had been Balkan wars for the last decade, concerned with many of these nationalistic questions. Who should own these areas? And it had been in the hands of the Ottoman Turks, who the Slavs definitely feel shouldn't have been running the place. And it was transferred to the hands of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which the Serb nationalists still don't feel should be running the place. And now the Archduke was coming on the anniversary of this historic defeat, from the Serb nationalist viewpoint, to rub their nose in the fact that Sarajevo is still held by a big non-Slavic empire. And they're going to make Franz Ferdinand pay for that. And in a remarkably similar situation to the Kennedy assassination, Ferdinand's route for his motorcade is published ahead of time. He's going to be arriving and going down the main boulevards in an open car with his wife sitting next to him. These multiple assassins line themselves up at various intervals along the parade route and plan to kill the Archduke as soon as they can. The Archduke's car is either going too fast, or there are too many other Serbs in the crowd nearby the first few assassins, so the first few assassins don't try to make a run at him. Eventually he passes one guy who runs out from the crowd with a bomb. Really more of a hand grenade would be a good way to describe it today. And he flings this hand grenade at the Archduke's open car. In a very athletic maneuver, the Archduke sees it, ducks behind the door of the car, the hand grenade thing bounces off the car, hits the concrete on the street, and the fuse doesn't detonate until the next car in the motorcade has passed over it. It explodes. Some 20 people are badly hurt, blood on the street, the whole thing, chaos, the crowd scatters. Obviously, the parade is over. The would-be assassin shoves a cyanide pill into his mouth and runs down to the side of the street and jumps in the river. But the cyanide pill is defective and only makes him vomit, and the river is only about 6 inches deep, so they capture him very quickly and run him off to be interrogated, and basically it looks like the whole day's been a failure. The other assassins, at least some of them, are supposed to have seen the Archduke's car speeding off. There you go. There goes the day. The motorcade goes in a couple of different directions. Some people are taken to the hospital. The Archduke and his wife, go to the town hall to lodge a complaint. They were going to make a speech anyway, but now they have an earful to give the local officials. We come to your town and this is the reception we get, that kind of thing. And it looks, at least from this point, like, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary just dodged a bullet, literally. There's some talk amongst the local officials about maybe figuring out a way to provide some increased security. But it doesn't seem to get very far, because within an hour after the first attack, the Archduke and his wife and their small motorcade is, off to the hospital. Supposedly, following an unplanned route for security reasons. There doesn't seem to be a lot of extra, police protection. We're told that an aristocrat, Count Franz von Harrach, was on the running board of the Archduke's car, so maybe a little extra protection. Turns out, though, that the driver, in one of those, little screw-ups that affect the entire history of the world, turns out the driver of the Archduke's car did not realize they were not taking the original parade route and makes a wrong turn. And ends up near a street corner where one of the assassins, Gavrilo Princip, maybe the guy on the grassy knoll with JFK, has stationed himself in the hopes that he might get a chance, maybe just be in the right place when the Archduke had to come by again, perhaps on his way out of town. The Archduke's driver makes a wrong turn. He's told by somebody in the motorcade that he's made a wrong turn and that he has to back up. He stops the car in preparation for backing up right by where Gavrilo Princip is. Princip is on that street corner where the motorcade's car takes a wrong turn and then stops while backing up. And he sees his target from less than an hour before, mere feet from him, immobile and slightly below him, in an open car. And he whips out his pistol and shoots him, and his wife. What are the odds of that happening? It's considered to be one of the most wild coincidences in all human history. How many times do assassins in a failed assassination attempt get a second chance to go after their target? And we sometimes forget, because it's such a monumental historical moment, that this is still a terrorist attack, and it was quite upsetting, to either witness or live through. Part of what makes these things seem so unreal is that we only have grainy black and white footage of even the events before that. You can go see movies where you can see the Archduke and his wife getting ready to go into the motorcade, and you get an idea of what they looked like, and it's all kind of moving a little too fast the way those old-fashioned movies were and everything, and it just doesn't look real. But you can go and you can see pictures, because they have saved the tunic that the Archduke was wearing that day, and you can see in living color that this was a bright light blue tunic, and the feathers on the helmet he was wearing were bright green. I mean, it must have been the most colorful sight imaginable, but after Princip fired, the most colorful sight imaginable became a lot more gory, because there's a tear in the tunic where the bullet exited the Archduke's neck, and the tunic is covered in what is unmistakably, even 100 years later, blood. And blood has always been one of those things where when you see it in living color, there's nothing like it. I tend to believe human beings are programmed to react to that specific color, always. And the difference between seeing blood in black and white and blood in color is, there's nothing quite like that. The person who was closest to the whole thing was Count von Harrach, who was on the running board, not doing that great of a job, apparently, at security. And he says as soon as the shots were fired, they reversed the car, and he later testified this, quote, "As the car quickly reversed, a thin stream of blood spurted from His Highness's mouth onto my right cheek. As I was pulling out my handkerchief to wipe the blood away from his mouth, the Duchess cried out to him, 'For God's sake, what has happened to you?' At that, she slid off the seat and lay on the floor of the car with her face between his knees. I had no idea that she too was hit, and thought that she had simply fainted with fright. Then I heard His Imperial Highness say, 'Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for the children.' At that, I seized the Archduke by the collar of his uniform to stop his head drooping forward, and asked him if he was in great pain. He answered me quite distinctly, 'It is nothing.' His face began to twist somewhat, but he went on repeating 6 or 7 times, ever more faintly as he gradually lost consciousness, 'It's nothing.' Then came a brief pause, followed by a convulsive rattle in his throat caused by the loss of blood. This ceased on arrival at the governor's residence. The 2 unconscious bodies were carried into the building where their death was soon established." End quote. And as a way to sort of prove that the old adage that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter is true, you have only to note that amongst Serbs today, many will consider Gavrilo Princip a heroic figure. Someone who, fired the first shots that started a chain of events that, while it will be horrible in both world wars for the Serbian people, eventually lead to, now, a time when those countries exist without, having to be just simply a province in some other major superpower's territories. To Serbs, this guy was a hero, and to his compatriots, who all realized that they were like desperados at the time, they all realized that they would be immortalized too. And the actual circumstances, by the way, where this plot was hatched are worthy of a spy novel. And it's hard to believe it hasn't been romanticized to some degree, but nevertheless, if you ever do the definitive big screen dramatization of World War I, the whole story, I think you want to start your movie off with that scene inside that Belgrade cafe. Obscure place, kind of run down, lit only by candlelight, with a group of 19 and 20-year-old guys at a table. I always have to remind myself how young these people are. Not old enough to legally drink alcohol in the United States is how old these people are. And then we're told by people who were there that what happened is one of their number comes in the door, sits down at the table with them, and has a package with him. And he opens up the package, and inside is only one thing: a newspaper clipping. No note, not signed by anybody, no directions, just a newspaper clipping, and the clipping announces the imminent visit of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand to Sarajevo. One of the people who was at that table and lived to grow older and write about his experiences after he'd had time to, go from terrorist to patriot, a guy named Borjov Jevčić. And if I mispronounce that, by the way, let's just get used to that. This is going to be perhaps the most linguistically and accentually challenging show I've ever done, and I'm sure to mangle many beautiful languages. First and foremost, French. So my apologies to all of you in advance. I'm sorry. I have limitations, and you're going to hear them all. Borjov Jevčić wrote years later this about that moment in history that will turn out to be so very important in a way that you can't imagine anyone at the table then would have known. They didn't know they were pulling the trigger again in that Russian roulette game, and they certainly didn't know that if they were, that was the time there was going to be a bullet in the chamber. Jevčić wrote, after the fact, quote, "A tiny clipping from a newspaper, mailed without comment from a secret band of terrorists in Zagreb, a capital of Croatia, to their comrades in Belgrade, was the torch which set the world afire with war in 1914. That bit of paper wrecked old proud empires. It gave birth to new free nations. I was one of the members of the terrorist band in Belgrade, which received it. And in those days, I and my companions were regarded as desperate criminals. A price was on our heads. Today, my little band is seen in a different light, as pioneer patriots. It is recognized that our secret plans, hatched in an obscure cafe in the capital of old Serbia, have led to the independence of the new Yugoslavia, the United Nations set free from Austrian domination." End quote. Now, ever since that time, people have been wondering how connected that group was to outside entities. They just a bunch of, small little self-organized terror groups put together by a bunch of young kids, or are they working for a larger entity? Today we would ask whether or not they were an example of state-sponsored terrorism. Was there a power behind this group, a rival power? And to understand how big of a deal this could be in a Europe that was already kind of unsteady and stressed in terms of stability, imagine the United States president, a president or two from now, we don't want to be controversial, down the road, is assassinated. And we have all the shock and anger and desire for retribution that comes with that. And then very shortly after an assassin is captured, we figure out that that assassin is working with the intelligence service of our most antagonistic enemy. Think for a second how America would have reacted if Lee Harvey Oswald had been a hitman for Moscow and that came to light. which, by the way, is not that outrageous a thing to consider when you look at Oswald's ties to the Soviet Union and Cuba. Think about how the American people would have reacted, regardless of what the facts were, if they thought that was the case. And it's interesting to note that that's only a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, a year after World War III is potentially dodged. What do you think the leaders of the United States, after Kennedy is assassinated, are worried about in terms of worst-case scenarios? Do you think it might have occurred to them, men who by the early 1960s had grown up during and in the immediate years after the First World War, do you think they might have been seeing in their mind's eye history repeating itself? A world leader killed by a gunman in an open car with his wife sitting next to him in public by a young person maybe working for a foreign government, and then having the world spiral out of control despite what the major players may have wanted? Do you think the people around Kennedy might have worried a little about how that might have turned out? Because those guys in that cafe very well may have been working for the Serbian intelligence service. There's been a lot written about this. No one knows for sure. They certainly have ties to groups that the United States today, if we were ranking groups from 1914, would probably call terrorist. Groups like Young Bosnia and another one called the Black Hand. And these groups had ties sometimes to the Serbian intelligence service. So you can believe the historian or the investigator you want to believe. It's a hot-button issue. Nonetheless, it isn't so important what really happened, just like it isn't so important whether or not Oswald was working for the Soviet Union. What's important is, what did the people on the ground affected by this think was happening? If the U.S. public thought Oswald was a hitman for Moscow, what happens then? The Austrians thought the killing of their heir to the throne was an act of state-sponsored terrorism. And if it wasn't, they were going to make the case that it was anyway. There's really no doubt that the Austro-Hungarian Empire wanted to deal with this Serbian problem that had been bedeviling it for some time, once and for all. And to be honest, it's hard to blame them. I mean, the Serbians and the Slavs will counter with the idea that the Austro-Hungarians had not possessed this territory for very long. Bosnia-Herzegovina and places like Sarajevo had not been Austro-Hungarian for a long time. Nevertheless, you try to think of what nation-state on the planet could put up with the nation over their border fomenting revolution in their country and eventually killing their public figures. I mean, imagine, if you're an American, this happening in the United States. Imagine, say, Mexico, creating instability and unrest and fomenting subversion and revolution in places like southern Texas and southern New Mexico and southern Arizona and southern California, and then eventually these revolutionaries that have been egged on by the Mexican intelligence service kill a major U.S. public figure. How long do you think the United States would put up with something like that? The reason it becomes so important, though, is because of all the many controversies in this story, one of the most enduring and important is whose fault everything that's about to happen is. If this is a civil lawsuit, trying to figure out who's responsible for damages is a key part of this story. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire is in a position to decide to go or not to go to war. That seems to put them in the driver's seat responsibility-wise. There are Austrians, though, living at the time who basically say, what choice did they have? Take this Austrian, writing after the war, as a perfect example. He talks about Archduke Franz Ferdinand as one of the best friends the Slavs ever had, and in effect, Ferdinand actually was counseling his government to treat the Serbian problem more lightly because he was worried about it sparking a general war. When he was killed, it was seen as an extra perfidious act because the Slavic folks had killed a person who had been, one of their better friends in the Austrian government. The Austrian that I was telling you about a second ago, after the First World War, wrote this, quote, When the news of the murder of Archduke Francis Ferdinand arrived in Munich, I happened to be sitting at home and heard of it only vaguely. I was at first seized with worry that the bullets may have been shot from the pistols of German students, who out of indignation at the heir's apparent continuous work of Slavization wanted to free the German people from this internal enemy. What the consequence of this would have been was easy to imagine. A new wave of persecutions, which now would have been justified and explained in the eyes of the whole world. But when, soon afterward, I heard the name of the supposed assassins, and moreover read that they had been identified as Serbs, a light shudder began to run through me at this vengeance of inscrutable destiny. The greatest friend of the Slavs had fallen beneath the bullets of Slavic fanatics. Anyone, he says, with constant occasion in the last years to observe the relation of Austria to Serbia, could not for a moment be in doubt that a stone had been set rolling, whose course could no longer be arrested. Those who today, he writes, shower the Viennese government with reproaches on the form and content of this ultimatum it issued, do it in injustice. No other power in the world could have acted differently in the same situation and the same position. At her southeastern border, Austria possessed an inexorable and mortal enemy who at shorter and shorter intervals kept challenging the monarchy and would never have left off until the moment favorable for the shattering of the empire had arrived. End quote. I actually agree with that, and it makes me uncomfortable, because the Austrian writing that statement after the First World War is the man most responsible for beginning the Second, Adolf Hitler. The one line that I think Hitler erred in, though, was his line that this stone had been set rolling that nothing could arrest. Because something could have arrested it, because something had been arresting it. There's a reason that the Austro-Hungarians hadn't attacked the Serbs already. And the reason was that the Serbs had a very powerful friend, the Russians, who considered themselves the traditional protectors of the Slavs. And the Serbs were not alone. Most of the powers of Europe had at least one, and usually more, powerful friends and allies. This was the era in European history, and it's often used as an example of one of the main reasons this whole story unfolds the way it does. This is the era of a very complex web of alliances that bind European countries to each other. It's perhaps the most enduring work of Otto von Bismarck, who we mentioned earlier, the 19th century German diplomat. Bismarck played a very large role in the foundation of modern Germany, but he also played a huge role in creating a system of alliances that both expanded, Germany's possibilities, while at the same time preserving a general peace in Europe. There were wars between Napoleon and the First World War, there's no doubt about that, and some of them were directly the fault of Bismarck. But there wasn't a general European conflict involving all the major powers. And let's not forget that this is an era that we would today call a multipolar world. It's just hard for us to understand in an era of one or two superpowers. Europe during this time period had at least 5 first-rate power states: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many people throw in Turkey and Italy too, which would make 7. These states all were bound to each other with complex alliance systems. And complex is the way Bismarck wanted it. Bismarck had set it up so that basically no matter what happened, he was in the driver's seat. And this worked unbelievably well, especially for German interests, but for European interests as a whole for a long time. But by the time 1914 rolls around, this genius who created this system that's so complex, only he knew how to run it. I've taken whole courses on Bismarckian diplomacy from professors who spent their whole life studying it, and they don't know why he did some of the things he did. While he was running it, it was fantastic. By the time 1914 rolls around, he hasn't been running it for some time. He'd been fired by the leader of Germany, and now this complex machine that the genius of Bismarck had created and run was being run by people who couldn't carry his jockstrap, is what we used to say. It was inevitable that something like that would break down. The reason that the Austro-Hungarians didn't just march into Serbia, the minute they found out that the Serbs were responsible for killing their heir to the throne, is that they knew that would mean war with Russia. And that is something that the Austro-Hungarians were not prepared for. At least not without checking with their main friend on the world stage and finding out, what they would do in that situation. Their main friend on the world stage was the German Empire. Now, the German Empire's attitude is very interesting. The first thing I have to keep reminding myself about the German Empire during this era is that it's relatively young. It's a new country almost. It was only founded in 1871. That's like 40 years before this era. And it wasn't just a new country. The minute it was proclaimed, and that's how it happened, you didn't proclaim England, you didn't proclaim France, but Germany as a modern nation, there was like a day where people signed papers and, okay, the next day, as of tomorrow, Germany exists. And the minute it existed, it was the most powerful land power in Europe. With a larger population than France, traditionally the greatest land power in Europe up till this time period, and a faster birth rate and more industry. And how destabilizing would it be in our world today if a couple of different nations of moderate power signed a piece of paper tomorrow that united them into one country, and that one now combined country was the most powerful country in the world? Even if it was just the most powerful land power or the most powerful sea power. You can see how a bunch of nations that really didn't deserve a lot of the perks that the super great nations claim for themselves might all of a sudden do that once they turn themselves into a super nation. In 1871, with the creation of Germany, the Kaiserreich, you have an instant great power on the world stage. It was Prussia on steroids, with a population like 8 times as much, and the rest of Germany with them, militarized on the Prussian model with the Prussian king. That's a very destabilizing thing. And when that country begins to demand some of the perks that the other great powers have, of their own, France, Great Britain, they've got all these colonies, all these other things. Little Holland to them looks like they've got places all over the world. What's going on? Sort of a factor of just having been there for a while. If you were around during the age of exploration and you had a bunch of ships out there, you were getting colonies. Germany didn't come around until most of the good stuff was taken. It was a cause of instability. Germany worried about being encircled. They had powers all around them that didn't wish them well. Historian Neil Ferguson, in a thing that I really thought was quite wonderful, because here in the West, those of us who fought the German Empire famously said that they had this sort of paranoia about being encircled. They were always worried about being encircled. Well, look at them on a map. They're born encircled. They're in Central Europe. They've got enemy powers all around them. Neil Ferguson said they weren't paranoid about being encircled. They were being encircled. And they were worried about an upcoming war. And up until Otto von Bismarck goes away, he had neutralized Russia. That was like one of the main things in his diplomatic alliance system. Keep the Russians happy. He said, in a 5 superpower world, make sure your country's one of 3. Right? So it's always 3 against 2. And Russia was always to be kept on your good side. When he is sacked, and basically the foreign policy begins to be heavily influenced by the German Kaiser, the emperor. Kaiser means Caesar, by the way. So imagine, calling your emperor Caesar in 1914. In any case, the Kaiser was a strange guy. He sacks Bismarck because Bismarck's kind of talking down to him and is kind of running the show, and he's an old guy by then, and he's much revered, and, how do you grow into your own man with that guy hanging over your shoulder? So he fires him, and he allows that machine to make vital mistakes Bismarck never would have made with that diplomatic machine. Vital mistake number 1, he lost the Russians. He intentionally drove them away, basically, right into the hands of the French. The historic German enemy, the one that they had beaten in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-1871 that allowed them to proclaim the German Empire, which they did in the French Palace of Versailles, which is sort of a rub your nose in it kind of thing. The Germans and the French assumed they'd fight each other again someday. Now the French were allied with the Russians, and now the German fears of encirclement had become a reality. The Germans had been trying to plan for what they're going to do with a war, against an enemy to their west and another enemy to their east at the same time, right? How do you do that? And now this situation in Austria boils over, and the Austrians say to the Germans, listen, if we get into a war with Serbia, Russia's going to attack us. If Russia attacks us, where do you stand? And the Kaiser, this is controversial, but traditionally the Kaiser is supposed to have told the Austrians to go for it. Get Serbia done now. And some historians, again, this is all very controversial. Everybody has a different opinion. But basically the idea seems to be that the Kaiser believed that if it was done quickly enough, the Serbians could be crushed before the situation spiraled out of control in Europe. Because even as moderately intelligent, we'll give him some credit that the Kaiser was, he knew that Europe was a powder keg. And the key thing that had to be avoided was this process. Almost a machine. The cranking up of a doomsday device that everybody who'd actually been present when the thinkers who dealt with the doomsday device explained what the doomsday device did understood that once the trigger on this thing was pulled, it was going to be really hard to turn it off. So if the Austrians could conquer the Serbians before the Russians, flipped the doomsday device switch, it would all be okay. Again, a lot of controversy on this because this is, again, another one of those places where the war guilt question hinges. Did Germany tell Austria to go crush Serbia, and who cares if the Russians attack everybody? But of course, the problem wasn't that it would just involve the Russians attacking everybody. Because of that complex web of alliances we talked about earlier, other countries were going to get dragged into the conflict. This was something that was well understood by the intelligent heads of Europe. Take, for example, the British Prime Minister during this time period, Herbert Asquith. Asquith wrote a letter, a private letter that's come down to the history books, right after Serbia receives the ultimatum from Austria that's so important. And Asquith writes, quote, "Austria has sent a bullying and humiliating ultimatum to Serbia, who cannot possibly comply with it, and then demanded an answer within 48 hours, failing which she will march. This means almost inevitably that Russia will come to the scene in defense of Serbia and in defiance of Austria. And if so, it's difficult for Germany and France to refrain from lending a hand to one side or the other, so that we are in measurable or imaginable distance of a real Armageddon. Happily, there seems to be no reason why we should be anything more than spectators." End quote. Well, that turned out, obviously, to be wishful thinking on the British Prime Minister's part. But historians like Neil Ferguson, who write revisionist works like The Pity of War, have suggested that if the British had stayed out, we'd have a better world today. For all sorts of reasons. I mean, he knocks off many of the biggest events of the 20th century, the most horrible, saying this never happens, that never happens, that never happens if Britain stays out of the war. Britain can stay out of the war because they don't have a hard alliance with anyone. They're not caught up in that web of alliances. Well, not too much. They have an understanding with France, an understanding with enough wiggle room so that there was a lot of talk in Britain about do we or don't we get involved in this whole thing. This whole thing was something that hadn't happened in 100 years in Europe, a general European war. It hadn't happened since Napoleon, since Waterloo. And that war was so terrible. Not just that war, the entire Napoleonic Wars and the Wars of the French Revolution, that era from like 1789 to 1815, so awful in terms of military destruction that a lesson had been taught to the crown heads of Europe. And the lesson was, war's not as much of a game anymore. It's no longer, these small private armies that we move around our European chessboard and, I lost to you, so you can have this province, and then next time I'll beat you and I'll take that province back, Nobody was trying to topple other regimes. It was, if anything, gentlemanly warfare, if there's ever been such a thing. It's been called in the history books limited warfare or restricted warfare. There was an Italian historian named Ferraro in 1933 who talked about how that era of warfare was the kind of warfare where, the leaders of countries could actually have fun going to war. War was something you just sort of did like pheasant hunting, at least in the minds of some of these guys. Ferraro writes, quote, "Restricted warfare was one of the loftiest achievements of the 18th century. It belongs to a class of hothouse plants which can only thrive in an aristocratic and qualitative civilization. We are no longer capable of it. It's one of the fine things we have lost as a result of the French Revolution." End quote. The French Revolution was when, warfare got, at least in the minds of the Europeans of this era, really serious. You want a war? Then we're going to go to war. The crown heads of Europe attacked France after France went all revolutionary. And you have to understand how much of a shock that was. Historian Gwen Dyer has a great way of describing it. He says, to understand the shock of the crowned heads of Europe when the most royal of European countries, the French, were overthrown by leftist revolutionaries, he says you have to imagine if Maoists toppled the U.S. government today. Maoists, of course, being a very hardcore communist group. Imagine them toppling today's U.S. government and beginning to govern. He goes, that's how the crowned heads of Europe felt about the French Revolution and how destabilizing it was seen. So inevitably, the royalty of Europe, which is almost all of Europe, clashes with this new republic in France and coalesces into an alliance, and everybody attacks France. And they do so with their private mercenary armies, and they run into the entire French population, a people in arms. Because France started by losing. You have to imagine a state where the entire underpinnings of the state have been broken down, including especially the army. And then Prussia, Russia, Austria, Great Britain, all these powers in Europe attack France at the same time. And you're stuck with, like a bit of your army left over. The artillery stayed with the people, so the old French artillery was good. But you've got this mishmash of an army with officers who don't have any authority. It's crazy. And France is about to be defeated. And then, as only, totalitarian-type regimes can do, they basically tell the people of France that the war is now everything. Our entire focus, the entire society exists only to win this war. The decree of the French National Convention in 1793 said, quote, "From this moment until that in which our enemies shall have been driven from the territory of the Republic, all Frenchmen are permanently requisitioned for service in the armies. The young men shall fight. The married men shall forge weapons and transport supplies. The women will make tents and clothes and serve in hospitals. The public buildings shall be turned into barracks, the public squares into munition factories. All firearms of suitable caliber shall be turned over to the troops. The interior will be policed with shotguns and cold steel. All saddle horses shall be seized for the cavalry. All draft horses not employed in cultivation will draw the artillery and supply wagons." End quote. In other words, the entire society was mobilized for the war effort. This was not something that the other countries did. In fact, most of the royal, leaders of Europe could think of nothing more scary than arming and training your population. Oftentimes, they used their professional militaries to put down rebellions by their population. The last thing they wanted to do was give them guns and train them how to use it, right? Train them how to be better street fighters. Wasn't going to happen. But the French had a different kind of society, one that was supposed to be run by the very, low-born people. Everybody was in this together, and you combine the willingness to throw human life, out there on the battlefield in almost endless numbers. You didn't have to pay these people either. You could just say, "I'm sorry, you're out of work right now. You're going to the front and steal some chickens from some farmer on the way." This was crazy. And all of a sudden, the French were able to expend lives on a scale that was unprecedented and to create armies that were enormous. Look at Alexander the Great, probably the greatest conqueror in all world history. Alexander conquers a very large chunk of the known world and a decent-sized chunk of the unknown world at the time with an army that numbered anywhere from 40 to 90,000 men, okay? And he was obviously a genius in the way he did it. But imagine if Alexander could have used a historical Xerox machine to duplicate that world-conquering army, so that now he's got two 40 to 90,000 man armies, roughly comparable to each other. Now imagine he does it again, and then duplicates it again, and then again, and then again. You do that enough times to where you've got 1.2, 1.3, 1.5 million men, maybe eventually closer to 3 million men, and now you've given Alexander the Great a 20th century army. A 20th century army is many, many armies from the past. The French Revolution is when that really starts. When you start putting so many troops into the field that it doesn't matter that they're practically incompetent, that their lives are wasted, that they're turned into cannon fodder as Napoleon, who will inherit this, people's army, that will conscript every man they want to conscript as long as they need them, will say, troops are born to be killed. And as Napoleon famously said to the Austrian diplomat Count Metternich, "You cannot stop me. I spend 30,000 lives a month." If any of the major powers, except maybe Russia, in Europe at this time, lost 30,000 men in a month, it would be considered quite a blow. Napoleon lost 30,000 men a month as a matter of course.
They're clear.
Because he had a new kind of army. He had a people in arms, and in order to beat him, the other countries of Europe had to do the same thing. As the German Field Marshal Blücher told the Prussian, government after the Prussians had been defeated by Napoleon, "Give me a national army. Give me what he has." And when he got it, which the Prussian aristocracy didn't want to do for the same reason that the European leaders everywhere didn't want to do it, they didn't want to put the people in arms, but when they did, they were able to triple the size of Blücher's army, and he took that army and fought Napoleon with it. The creation of a nation in arms was the first step in creating the modern war machine, because now all of a sudden, life was cheap. Not only was life cheap, but the modern nation state was now deep enough to be able to truly take a punch. And this is what sets the modern militaries off and the modern states off from the ones in ancient times. In ancient times, very few states could take a punch, to use a boxing term. Many of them could dish it out. When you take a state like the Achaemenid Persians, the ones who fought the Spartans at Thermopylae and all that, the Persians could dish out really good blows, but they couldn't take very many good blows. Most nations in the past couldn't. That's why if you look at a book, the greatest battles in history, if it's beyond, about 150 years ago, sometimes the great battle is the only battle. Wars are won or lost on one big battle because the nation states couldn't take too many punches. They couldn't re-raise armies. The state just couldn't support it. Once France turns the entire nation into the war effort, nations can take punches better. In the past, the Mongols and the Chinese could take some punches. The Roman Empire could take punches. That's what set those nation states in the past apart from most of their enemies, right? They had more staying power. They had modern staying power. The French Revolution teaches all these states to have modern staying power. The only problem with modern staying power is that the killing can go on longer. In boxing, they always feel like an early knockout is more merciful than a long match, because in a long match, you take a lot more punishment. Well, in a funny way, if everything could be decided at one big horrific battle, at the start of a war, that is a lot less costly over time than a 4 or a 5 year long conflict where both sides grind each other down to the nub. The Napoleonic Wars created multiple states in Europe capable of fighting until they were ground down to the nub, which meant a lot more damage and destruction before these wars came to a halt. The modern nation state provided the support that the militaries that involved entire peoples in arms needed to keep the struggle going, for long periods of time. One half of the equation necessary to create the modern war machines. As military historian Gwen Dyer writes right after he talks about the human costs of these long Napoleonic wars, he says, quote, "Almost as important is the fact that European society did not break down under the strain. There was hardship, but no starvation, and the warring powers were able to keep at it and keep their people at it, year after year with no end in sight. The European states had developed the wealth, the organizational techniques, and the methods of motivation needed to fight mass wars with a degree of popular participation that no other civilized society had ever even approached. All that was lacking," he writes, "to transform mass warfare into total war was the technology. But the Industrial Revolution was already almost a generation old in 1814, and soon it would begin to fill the last remaining gap." End quote. What was missing to make this new deadly machine that the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution created was the technology to increase the deadliness by exponential amounts. And that was already something that was happening. The 1800s are an era in military history where the killing power of machines skyrockets. And machines have been an important part of battlefields since before there were cities and human societies to field mass armies at all. Think of the bow and arrow. That's a Neolithic weapon. That's a Stone Age machine that made man a more efficient killer, both in hunting, but on the battlefield as well. By the time the 1800s roll around, the machine's killing power skyrockets. But because there is no major war involving all the great powers between Napoleon and the First World War, the actual demonstration of how this stuff can be used is lacking. And the military powers of the world try to examine the conflicts that do happen to see if they can learn any lessons about what the next war is likely to be like. There were European observers, for example, at the American Civil War to try to see, what you could learn from that. The Crimean War breaks out in the 1850s between Russia and Britain and France.
Where's their spawn at?
There's a war, obviously, between the United States and Spain that involved Cuba and the Philippines, right around the turn of the century, going into the 1900s. Probably most importantly, there's a war between Japan and Russia in 1905, where some of the use of these, new weapons that, when fused together, create the modern war machine, where some of that was observable. The one thing that seems to be the key element, as far as European planners can figure it out, though, is something that harkens back to a phrase from a Confederate general in the U.S. Civil War, who said that the key to warfare was to get there firstest with the mostest. And the idea now of these mass armies that Europe had created was that you needed to be able to raise them and get them to the battlefield before the other side beat you to it. The timetable for mobilization becomes a force that none of the major European powers seem to be anything but a slave to once the assassin's bullet in Sarajevo cuts down the Austrian Archduke. When the Archduke is killed by Princeps, he does the equivalent of pulling a pin on a hand grenade. Imagine trying to hold negotiations to ward off an explosion with a guy who's already pulled the pin on the grenade, right? You have a limited amount of time to convince them of anything. Winston Churchill, during his life, had famously said that jaw was better than war. Negotiations always better than war. But if the person's already pulled the pin on the hand grenade, you have a very short window of opportunity to avoid the inevitable. And that's where Europe finds itself after the Archduke is murdered. Everybody's worried about the same thing, too. There's an old phrase the peace movement used to use in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where they would say, what if they gave a war and nobody came? Well, the military planners in Europe at this time period are worried about something a little bit different. What if war breaks out, and on the days that hostilities commence, only one side's got their army there? And if it takes you 30 days to get your reservists in uniform to the mustering point and to the battlefield before they're ready to fight, how big of a deal is it if it only takes your opponent 15 days to do the same thing? This puts a huge crunch, time-wise, on everybody in this story and constrains the ability to negotiate your way out of this situation. Everybody feels like, okay, the first person that flips the mobilization switch, we all go, because nobody wants to fall behind. The Germans have constrained themselves even more time-wise by the way that they have found a solution to their terrible dilemma of how do you fight a two-front war. Once you violate Bismarck's dictum of, keep the Russians on your side, and then the Russians and the French ally with each other, and war breaks out, you're going to be fighting the French in the West and the Russians in the East at the same time. And in the intervening decades, the fantastic German general staff had figured out a way to not just survive that situation,